Hello and welcome to Soul Portals, exploring psychospiritual horizons with your hosts Cedric Spire and Deanna Nagel. Cedric is an author and therapist who developed the interview guidance model and is a pathfinder in the psychospiritual realm. Deanna created the Essential Soul Care model, a model suitable for therapists, coaches, and healers. The monthly episodes of Soul Portals feature guests sharing insights from their personal paths and professional practices. Thank you for tuning in for the Soul Talk with all kinds of trailblazing teachers and guides as Cedric, Deanna, and guests explore new evolutionary landscapes.
So the Soul Portals invocation that I like to open with, it's a brief one. May the spirit flow freely through our conversation, allowing it to be both energizing and edifying. And then an opening quote to kick us off in the right direction. And this is from Gary's book, our special guest, who specializes in consciousness studies and just finished this great book last night, Secret History of Consciousness. And in your own words, Gary, on page 175, to be sure, as I can say from my own experience, the shock of feeling one's inner world to be directly and intimately linked to the outer one is vitalizing, to say the least. And to a certain extent, we all experience something of this sort already. Anyone who has been baffled by a curiously apt synchronicity knows there is more to our relation with the world than what the science that denies these experiences suggests. And then continuing a bit, yet it's not all in the mind. We do not, quote unquote, create reality. There clearly is a reality outside us. What we do create is our representation of it, and it is to this we are responsible. Does that sound familiar?
Yeah, I'll have to check. I'll have to get my copy and take a look. No, I'm sure that's clear and better than I thought I could express it. But no, yes, that sounds pretty good. Yes, thank you.
Yeah, because in our audience, especially the live audience, there's a lot of counselors and therapists. And yeah, I was thinking, as I got to know your material better, that we take the inner life for granted. And you show in that book how it wasn't always the case that humanity was aware that we had an inner life.
Yes.
Actually, to set the stage for the conversation, you could say a bit about that, like the thesis statement of your book about consciousness and the phases it went through.
Well, I mean, in the book itself it's kind of a collection of different notions about consciousness and sort of an evolution of consciousness that get left out of the discussion much of the time. Usually when there's a discussion about consciousness, there's what I call the three S's, although it's phonetically, spelling it's not quite it, but it's scientific or the spiritual, which I think probably can encompass something what I was talking about in there, or which I think usually it's more like meditation or Buddhist sort of approach to it in some way. And then the psychedelic, which is PSY, but it's and that's usually mind-altering drugs in the discussion or investigation of consciousness. And what I did in that book is just put together lots of other sorts of stuff that I've been reading over the years and saying there's a whole other story or a narrative. And the basic idea is that at a certain time, and I would think we can even chart this historically, the sort of self-consciousness that we have, that we're used to having, our awareness of our awareness. which leads to lots of problems and sets us apart from the rest of the world, or I would say in some way enables us to actually have a world that we can reflect upon and be an observer in. This might not have been the case at earlier times. And that idea comes up in different writers. There's a Swiss-German philosopher, Jean Gebser, who talks about different structures of consciousness. But he doesn't like the word evolution because he thinks that's associated with particular structure of consciousness we're in at the moment, with the tail end of what he called the mental rational. And so evolution for him is linked up with notions of 19th century progress and things of that sort. So he thinks in terms of mutations. There's another thinker, a fellow named Owen Barfield, who was he was one of the Inklings. He was close friends with C.S. Lewis and Tolkien. And he wrote a lot about language and poetry. He was also a follower of Rudolf Steiner. But he had this notion, and he spells it out in a wonderful book called History in English Language, where the further you go back in the history of language, the more poetic and metaphoric and imaginative the language is, which seem contrary to precisely those kind of 19th century notions of progress. You start out with something very simple, ugh, ugh, or whatever, some noise, and that's over time somehow became a word or something. And he said, no, there is no phase in the history of language where it's ugh, ugh. The furthest we go back, it's always very metaphoric and it's living. And he's saying, the Darwinian type people looking at the history of language would say, well, at one point there was some strange mutation of a whole generation of poets, prehistoric poets who suddenly were flourishing with all these metaphors. And then that's why that happened. He said, no, it's not like that at all. It's the way it is because people back then saw the world in that way. And they didn't see it in the distinct subject-object, way that we see it as something completely other than ourselves and very definite and hard and, we can bang up against. It was more like a kind of flowing, fluid kind of relationship between the two. So those are various different ways in which, and there's others in there that I look at this notion. So what we understand as consciousness is something that's been arrived at, you can say historically. It's not something consciousness per se.
Yeah, and does the individual journey parallel the one of humankind in phases?
Oh, I would think so. I think, there's evidence to quite a bit of it that suggests that, the early phases of childhood from, I guess, up to about 2, that's the child is in a sort of Ouroboros relationship with the mother. So it doesn't really recognize itself at first as something other, something separate. And then you hit the terrible 2s when, no, and they learn how to say no, which is the word. It's just like Sartre. They all start to be Sartrean existentialists at 2 because they say no and they negate. And then that separates them from the great surround, which we later on want to find our way back to in some sense, because that's what we lose contact with as we develop our individual ego. So I would say, yes, that's the case. And I would also suggest, and many of the writers I look at in that book, in some way, they suggest this, that the self-consciousness we have, it can itself is at time transcended, and we, as I say in that quote, we have an experience in which that sort of participatory relationship with the outside world happens again, but at a level when we're aware of it. We're not completely plunged and embedded in it as we were when children, when we didn't know about it. It was just like that. So those poetic moments, those aesthetic moments, those moments of sort of meditation, when suddenly, the subject object, the barrier is permeated, and we have that wonderful sense again.
Yeah. That's sorry, Deanna.
Yeah, I'm just thinking as you're talking, just wondering, given that I know a little bit of your bio and that you were a musician and then you decided to begin your writing, I think at 40. What is the passion behind your obvious understanding of the mystics of the world?
That's a good question. I started reading about all this sort of thing back when I was a musician. So this takes us back nearly 50 years ago, 1975. I was living in New York on the Bowery. And if you know New York, that was when the Bowery was the Bowery. It was Skid Row, it just homeless and so on. And I was playing in the then unknown band Blondie, later went on to become very successful. But we were living in we had a floor in a building, sort of like a loft space. And the fellow who rented the floor to us, he lived in the building as well. And he was a devotee of Aleister Crowley. I mean, I have a map here that I'm not a devotee myself, but I guess I'm some degree an expert on it. I've written a book about it and all that. So, but this is how I got interested in it. And he would give these impromptu tarot readings with this Crowley Thoth deck, and he did these canvases. He was a painter, flamboyant, gay, wild biker. And one of the books I had no interest in the occult, magic, anything like that. I read a lot. I read Hermann Hesse and existentialism and stuff like that, and the Beats. But my only interest in the occult was horror fiction, like H.P. Lovecraft or old horror films, Boris Karloff and all that. And but one of the books I came across at this time was a book just called The Occult, and it was by a British writer named Colin Wilson. And literally, that book changed my life. It was such a good read. And his approach to it was a philosophical approach. I didn't know at that time that he had a whole career writing about existentialism and phenomenology and all this stuff that I didn't know much about. And I just was taken with the book. And so it just introduced me to all of these characters I subsequently, many years later, wound up writing about. And so it started out as just like a fan enthusiasm, for this is wow. And gradually I just became more and more interested in it in a couple of ways. One in which the sorts of experiences or states or that in various ways were discussed by these people of consciousness. What was that about? I wanted to explore those. And then I became interested in also the history of it and how these ideas have informed a lot of our mainstream culture. So the first book I did was a book about the 1960s called Turn Off Your Mind. And it was about how the occult and the mystical and the magical influenced pretty much all of the popular culture, say from about the mid 60s until the very end.
That's awesome. I mean, that's, you're describing a lived experience that you actually had this, well, in my language, somewhat of an awakening with what was around you and what you were reading, and then it became what you do.
Oh yeah. I mean, I just became fascinated with it. And I mean, I started having odd experiences, and then a group of them happened while I was on tour. And my girlfriend and I at the time, we seemed to be having shared dreams, or we would know when the other one was going to call. And this was much before, cell phones and mobile phones. You had, in a hotel room in Detroit and
right.
Yeoman's in New York, and also stuff like that. And so I wound up, this happened quite a bit. And I wound up writing a song called I'm Always Touched by Your Presence, Dear. And that was a hit in the UK and Europe, not in the States, but in UK and Europe, longer ago than I care to remark on. But it was a song about our telepathic relationship. And at the same time, or not long after, I read a book called An Experiment with Time. And this is by a fellow named J.W. Dunn, who wasn't he wasn't really an occultist, but he was an aeronautics engineer. But he discovered that he dreamt the future, bits and pieces of the future turned up in his dream. And said, check it out for yourself. Just start writing your dreams down. And I did. And lo and behold, I started recording all these precognitive dreams. That started in 1980. And I even did a book about this during the first lockdown here with COVID called Dreaming Ahead of Time. And it's based on a stack of dream journals I have going back to the mid 1980s, and which I plucked out all of, to me, the more convincing kind of precognitive dreams. So I've had and synchronicities and coincidences. So I've had those sorts of experiences. And then over time, I hope my reading has got more acute and serious and critical, and I've, arrived at, somewhat sober assessment of these sorts of things.
What was the name of that song again?
Oh, the song is "I'm Always Touched by Your Presence, Dear."
Okay.
And it came out in 1978, and it was a big hit on Blondie. And it's paid the rent for me quite a few times, so I'm very thankful for it. So.
And based on your concept of time, this podcast may have already occurred.
Well, if you follow poor old Nietzsche's ideas of eternal recurrence, it's happened already, and has happened already many, many times. So, but I always figured out if it, because he's very strict about it. It's eternal recurrence. It's the recurrence of the exact same. And this is the way he posits this in The Gay Science. It's a what if. What if one night some demon said, this moonlight, the spider web, and I forget exactly, but that's kind of the context. All of this that you're seeing now, you have seen innumerable times before, and you will see innumerable times again without change, no change whatsoever. What would you think of that? That's basically, and so if you think that it's eternal recurrence, exactly the same. So it's exactly the same. There's only this now. There's only this now. No matter how many times it's recurred, it doesn't matter how many times it's recurred because the content is exactly the same. It's this now. So how do you feel about this now? That's right. I think that's what it comes down to. Uspensky, I'm sorry, go ahead. That's
the classic question in therapy. How do you feel now?
Yeah.
And that brings up the issue of change. If there's eternal recurrence, what does it take to change and shift and break patterns?
Well, I was going to say that's Uspensky, P.D. Uspensky, who was most known as a sort of exponent of the ideas of G.I. Gurdjieff, this enigmatic Armenian esoteric teacher. But he was a Russian writer and philosopher in his own right. And his pet idea was the eternal recurrence. But he believed it was possible to change if you awake during one of them. If you somehow make efforts, it's possible. Most of it is exactly the same. And there's some people who are so embedded in life that they will never, ever change. But he thought of it, think of it as like a big wall, right? And there's a couple little pebbles in there that if they move, nothing's going to happen to the wall. The wall isn't going to fall down. Nothing like that will happen. And it isn't like in all the sci-fi movies, if you go back in time, and if you step off the path, suddenly you go back and, Hitler won, World War II and whatever it is, no, you can, little people who don't get caught up in huge, big events can make little changes in their life. And so, whether that's true or not, but for him, it was more like a reincarnation back into the life, but you could somehow work to remember.
And I was going to say, it has a lot in common with classical Hinduism.
Oh, yes. Yeah, sure. No, absolutely. Although for him, it isn't reincarnating into another life. It's going back into he wrote an interesting novel about it called Strange Life of Ivan Osokin. And it's about this kind of poetic, bohemian, young, Russian guy who's screwed up his life, and he's, about to blow his brains out, and he meets a magician, and the magician sends him back, and he thinks he can change things, but he does exactly the same thing. So it's a bit gloomy. But I mean, I always associate Nietzsche's with Rilke in the Duino Elegies. He says once and once only. Now, but now ever so intensely, like the angels are, very intense. Their being is so intense that it overwhelms us. So if you can somehow achieve that affirmation, that vision of affirmation in the now, then you're somehow breaking out of the recurrence itself. It isn't gloomy. It's not a gloomy recurrence. So
yeah. And I want to just make a point for the therapists in the room that in the context of therapy, these are the numinous moments. These are the moments that are seemingly just par for the course. But if there's one shift in consciousness or awareness or intention, then the client can go a different path. So that's what came to mind as you were describing that. Yeah.
About the Gebser, so Ken Wilber lifted his paradigm from Gebser, right?
Yeah, I have to say I never have been a big reader of Ken Wilber. I read a couple of his books. I reviewed one ages ago.
Mm,
I always found it a bit too sort of scientific, if you know what I mean. I mean,
yeah.
just the way he writes about things, and I'm sure he's doing good work. And the other thing I have to say, I led me to not be interested in him is that he thought very highly of Dafri John, who I remember being a kind of, I don't know, maybe I don't know about him, but one of these gurus that seemed quite dubious. When I worked for many years at a metaphysical New Age bookshop in Los Angeles in the late 80s into the early 90s, a place called the Bodhi Tree that was very well known in its day. It doesn't exist anymore, but in its day, it was, quite well known. So I came to know a lot of, at the same time, I was working on a degree in philosophy. So I was having this dual life. I was getting a BA in philosophy and studying Wittgenstein and Hegel, and
Right.
then talking to people about their auras and showing them how to use the I Ching and getting that crystal that's going to dispel all negativity.
And now you have
Uh,
Watkins bookstore, right, in the
yeah,
UK?
yeah. That's in London. Yeah, it's sort of the equivalent. It's sort of the equivalent. But the Bodhi Tree, I worked at its heyday during like the heyday of the New Age, and it was like quite the place. But I'm just saying that's how I sort of know. I got familiar with a wide range of sorts of things while I was there. But yeah, I don't know. I never quite got into Wilbur. And then I did have some contact with someone who was sort of a fellow named Andrew Cohen, who was a guru for a while here in London. He had something called Enlighten Next in the 2000s.
Oh yeah.
And he had a magazine called Enlighten Next, and I wrote some articles. I wrote an article about Gebser and some other things for them. I remember around 2012, I wrote something about called, the 2012 meme, when it was one of the many end of the world memes. Quetzalcoatl was coming back, and that was like the tail end of when I started working at the Bodhi Tree in 1987. There was something called the harmonic convergence,
Mhm.
and people were going out to
I
the
remember.
desert at Mount Shasta and meditating to bring on the vibes. And then the denouement was supposed to be 25 years later in 2012.
Oh, how come you didn't become more new agey yourself?
Well, I'm saying I'm reading Wittgenstein. I'm reading the philosophical investigations, and I'm working my way through the phenomenology of mind
Right. So
while I'm at the university, and then I'm there. And so I felt I was left and right brain.
Yeah.
I think I'm a walking example of that, because then I used to be, wild musician jumping around on stage, very Dionysian, and I moved into this Apollonian other realm now where I'm
yeah.
writing all the time. So
And
I
then
I didn't think to do that, but it seems, oh, that's actually when I think about it. That seems to what has
and
happened.
according to the dialectical model, then that's the third principle emerges, right?
So yes, I'm waiting for the transcendent function to kick in, and
Okay.
with any luck, it does when I'm writing well, and that's
Yeah.
when it counts.
And have you had any like epiphanies, revelations personally, breakthroughs that you'd like to
Well,
share?
yes. Well, actually, well, there's one thing that's it's the next thing I'm going to be writing about. Well, I'll tell you something. I mentioned the first lockdown here in London. And I have to say, I know it's a horrible thing to say, but I have lockdown nostalgia, because it was quiet. You could hear the
Yeah.
birds. The air was clean, and all of that. And I'm very privileged. It was more of an inconvenience to me than anything else. But one morning, I remember walking out, just opened my garden door out into my garden here, and looking up and thought, "What's that?" And it was the sun. And for a moment, I was totally surprised by the sun. And it was, if my neighbors had heard me, I started cackling. I started laughing, like, "What the?" Suddenly, I'm just, what is that thing up there? And then, everything else kicked. Oh, yes, it's the sun. It's 93 million miles away. Blah blah blah. Everything I know about it, but for however many nanoseconds, it was some, primal perception of this
Hmm.
thing, actually three-dimensional sort of thing. It's not a flat surface, a picture, cinema. I was somehow aware of, all very quickly. And I wrote an article about that, and I mentioned this writer Colin Wilson, and I became quite a fan and devotee of his work and a friend over time, and we had a 30-year friendship, and I wound up writing a book about him as well.
Now, let it be said that you're the natural successor to Colin Wilson.
Okay, well, I mean, I guess I'm reminded of Goethe, who said, beware what you wish for in youth, because you will get it at middle age. So I must have wanted that when I quit. Well, that's the thing. I got too smart for rock and roll. I kept reading his books.
Yeah.
And what I wanted to say, I couldn't say in a pop song anymore. It became, and when you try to do that in a pop song, it just sounds too earnest, or it's it's not the media for that kind of thing. And I decided, I spent 10 years learning how to write anything that, not only would anyone read, that they would pay me to do. So it took quite a year to do this. Excuse me, I keep hitting the table. But in any case, so Wilson has this idea, what he calls, very simple, something he calls the robot. And the robot is this evolutionarily labor-saving sort of device that we've developed. And basically, when you learn how to type, when you first learn how to type, you have to look at where every letter is on the keyboard, and it's like this and like this and like that. You make lots of mistakes, but then one day, bang, you can just do it. Or you're not doing it, your hands or whatever, some other part of you is doing it. Then you can think about what you want to type, right? Or riding a bike. You try to ride a bike. When you first try to do it, you fall over and all that. And finally, you manage to do it. And then you can think about where you want to go. So that bit that's doing it is what Wilson calls the robot. I mean, it's absolutely necessary. But like a too eager valet, it does things you'd rather do yourself. And it starts to take over. And, oh, don't let me do it. So it starts seeing the sunsets, and it starts listening to music, and it starts whatever, all the stuff that you'd like to do yourself that you get pleasure from. Suddenly you're not getting the pleasure anymore because you're not doing it. You aren't there. The robot's doing it. The robot's it's not a villain, but we allow it to take over. But in moments of crisis, suddenly instinctively we push it aside, and we're there. And this is one of the reasons why Gurdjieff was brilliant, because he was a master at creating artificial crisis and artificial inconvenience that he called it you being mechanical or being asleep, but that would shock people out of that. But what I think happened when I was surprised by the sun is, I think because it was lockdown, I was in kind of, little crisis mode, crisis light kind of mode. So it meant that I had to go shopping different places, and you couldn't be out too often, and my routine was changed a bit. So it was slight difference and slight that, and just I think the little bit of effort that I was putting into everyday things because of crisis mode somehow pushed the robot aside. And when I walked out that morning and I looked up, I saw the sun. Probably the first time since I was about 5 years old. And it was like, what is that? And so it's that, what is that moment? So I'm been discussing a book idea with one of my publishers for something along, that kind of thing.
Wilson had the idea that it could be sustained with intentionality, with effort, that you could meet reality in a way where you're not asleep, like an automatic pilot, which is what the robot is. Right?
Yeah. No, he believed if you, well, he said, he always tells the story of the writer Graham Greene. When he was a teenager, he was bored to tears, and he had gone through Freudian, psychoanalysis, and he was well adjusted, but he just was he wasn't getting any joy out of life in any way whatsoever. And he was so bored that one day when he found his brother's revolver, his brother had a revolver for some reason, in the corner cupboard, he took it, put a bullet, and spun the chambers, and he went out to the common, and he was going to play Russian roulette. He'd been reading about it. And so he's so bored, like, I'll just try to blow my brains out. Let's see what happens. And he put it to, and I'm doing a Colin Wilson now, he put it to his head. And when he clicked the trigger and he just heard an empty click, Grain said that suddenly it was as if, lights went on all over the world, and I saw infinite possibility. And suddenly he wasn't bored. Nothing had changed except something changed in him. And Wilson said, what happened? It was like, he went like that, involuntarily made this kind of, made a fist of his mind.
Lucky, otherwise we would have lost a lot of novels.
Well, from Wilson's point of view, just as well, because they're very gloomy and pessimistic, that he would say. But we can put that aside. Writers are always, they never have a good word to say about other writers. But so it's that, and again, that's what Gurdjieff did. He created situations, and people would be put in situations where they would have to somehow focus and concentrate. And I talk about it. I recently did a book about this fellow Maurice Nicoll, who started out as a Jungian. He was Jung's British lieutenant 100 years ago in London now. He was with Gurdjieff and Uspensky by now, but say 1920. He was a follower of Jung, and then he became a follower of Gurdjieff and Uspensky. But he talks about Gurdjieff's method of frustration, creating these situations where you would be like you get like that, and somehow he would generate second wind. Athletes, athletes, when they feel they can't, they're doing the marathon and they just don't have an ounce left of any energy, but they try one more time, and bang, as a new petrol tank opens up, and they're zooming. And so that's, again, Wilson is fond of quoting this line from William James in an essay of his called The Energies of Men, where he says, "We live subject to degrees of fatigue which we have come only from habit to obey." So we accept a certain level of, okay, this is it. This is my usual consciousness. This is everyday consciousness and something like that. And it's like a very low level where we could be on a higher kind of level. And these crisis situations force us to do that.
So the peak experience, and right?
Yeah.
So let me put in a devil's advocate challenge on Wilson, maybe you too. Because the idea that we can break through and live continuously in that state of heightened awareness, it seems to take out the whole feminine side of life and the cycles and the mountains and valleys and valleys and the organic, cyclical, feminine nature of the world, as opposed to the masculine quest, to reach that state and stay there, right?
Yeah.
So what do you say?
This is actually an argument or a criticism that Maslow, the originator of peak experiences, had with Wilson, and because they were friends. But in his journals, he wrote that about this Wilson. He said he's too intellectual, it's too cerebral, it's too much will, and he doesn't have the more meditative or plateau. And I can understand. No, I can appreciate that. But I think at the same time, Wilson does talk about going into deep states of relaxation. It's not only that; it's also that's one way. It's one way you can get the robot, get the reins, get the wheel back, from the steering wheel back from the robot. But another way is you can relax into deep poetic states. And he talks about that's the essence that. I think well before people were talking about right and left brain, and Wilson was talking about right and left brain in the late 70s, early 80s. But even before that, it doesn't matter the physiology or where these two different ways of being are located. Obviously, we know them, but he also talks about getting into deep sort of poetic sorts of states when we can relax. And that's, in one sense, that's why he was very fond of drinking wine, because it's poetry in a bottle. You have a glass of wine, suddenly, you're not at war with yourself anymore, and things become, what looked really boring is very interesting. Hence, why many writers and poets become alcoholics. No, I think you're right about that, but I don't think he means being on it constantly. I think he even says that we don't really need to be at this. What we need is to have it. That's the underpinning. We know. Okay, it's like, okay, is it ultimate yes or ultimate no? That's how we started out as outsiders. These 19th century, early 20th century, romantic figures who had these moments of ecstasy, but then they had to go, to work the next day.
Right.
And they go ups and these downs, and which one's right? And they in many of them, they become a bit enfeebled from the higher states because it makes them less able to deal with the everyday world.
Exactly.
And
Yep.
yeah, so he said, okay, is there a way for one to have those kinds of visions without succumbing to, the everyday world? And then, or he say historically, well, the existentialists came around and they were tougher, but they're stoic. They don't have the kind of vision, they have the insight into meaning and the need for meaning and things of that sort. And the scientific reductionist picture is inadequate and all that.
Hmm.
And they have insight into our own modes of
Right.
self-deception.
So it
But it's
comes
all,
back, sorry,
no, you go on.
it comes back to double awareness. So that you have the robot ego
Mm,
engaged
Yep.
in wheels of life, plus you have this background bird's eye awareness going at the same
mm.
time.
Well, that's the thing. I mean, and I think what Wilson is saying is like we've been sort of enculturated to have this negative view. It's what Gebser calls the difference between Urangst and Urvertrauen, like primal fear and primal trust. But we tend to start with primal fear. It's like, ooh, something's going to whack me in the head, and so I have to sort of be alert all the time, and we're hyper tense like that. And those moments of deep, I know I know this stuff intellectually, but I'm a victim of it as well. I mean, I can
But
tell you.
So
I was going to say
yeah,
just
that
like that.
begs the question.
I'm
Do
sorry.
you have a practice? Do you have any kind of psycho-spiritual or spiritual practice yourself?
Well, I
That
try
you've
to pay
experienced?
attention when it does happen. And I was going to tell you a story. I was back in early in the year, back in the spring. I was in Granada in Spain for a while to see the Alhambra. And it was lovely and all that. But by the time I had to leave, my plans were I didn't plan it very well, and I had a lot of time before getting to my flight and all that kind of thing. And I had to leave the Airbnb I was in early. So I was kind of tramping around for hours, killing time, and I'd already walked and walked a lot, and I was like tired and depressed. And there was this one local tapas bar that I wanted to go into, but it looked too local. I was a little intimidated to go in as a tourist and all that. And I was trying to remember my Spanish and all that kind of thing. And I said, screw this, you've come all this way, just go in there. So I went in and I sat down, and they were very friendly. And suddenly my high school Spanish started to come back to me. And I said, oh yeah, I know what that is. I know what that is. And so I ordered something. And you order something, and I ordered a glass of wine, and you order something, but they give you something extra on top. It's like, here's your glass of wine, here's what you ordered, and here's a little treat. And I sipped my wine, and suddenly I felt everything just relaxed. And I wanted to move to Granada. I said, yeah, I'm going to come. This is wonderful. I just felt I'll just come back here. I'll learn Spanish. And I sat there for the rest, however time I needed until I got, to my flight. So it was like a mini peak. But I said to myself, Mike, what happened? Why, how did you go from, and it wasn't just because you can have a glass of wine and still be grumpy. It's not like that's not a miracle cure. Sometimes it helps, a lot of times it doesn't. But I just was like, oh, and I just okay, what happened? So I guess I'm trying to do the phenomenology of my Granada experience. So like what happened? And is it like what happened when I was surprised by the sun or
right.
things like that? But no, I mean I try to linger in the morning and remember my dreams, and I write my dreams down. I do that regularly. And I do try to take out a bit of time every day I can, just to sort of just relax. It sounds not particularly spiritual, and I don't necessarily mean, chill out, but I mean just sort of like, okay, because I'm, and it's partially what I do for a living. I mean, it's hard to make a living as a freelance, writer, especially, the sort of thing I do, and I'm very lucky that I am doing it. And able to do it, but I sort of have to, keep working all the time. And I'm a Capricorn, and the Capricorns are like that. They're just ambitious. It's work, 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 work.
So what I hear as you talk is that your Bodhi tree experience and your sun experience and your Granada experience is the balance to the intellectual writing that you do. It's the yin and the yang. It's the divine masculine, the divine feminine. So it sounds like, whatever's forward fronting in your life that people see may be different than the balance you find in your own, for all of us, the balance that we find in our own lives.
Mm.
That's just
Well,
what.
yeah. Well, again, the one thing people do say, and I don't mean to blow my horn, but they say about my books is that there's a good balance, and I achieve it in the books probably more than I do in my life, but that's the virtue of creativity. Creativity
Mhm.
makes up for
Right.
all the contingent, what is it? Ineluctable life, I think Baudelaire called it. Somehow the stuff that it's just in the way, no matter what you do, and it makes up for that. So I know myself. That's when I feel most alive and most, aside from the surprised by the sun and Granada experiences, when if I'm
Right.
writing well, my sense of I, or me, whatever it is, it's like it's like smack in the right place, and I hope it's reflected in the writing.
Absolutely. So yeah, that is your practice. Like some people meditate, some people climb mountains and
Hmm.
do these very well researched books.
Well, and
Yeah.
I've also worked, I worked at actually the writing itself. I mean, it's not deathless prose, but I know, I look back, stuff I wrote, whatever, 20 years ago, and more recently, it's different. There's a surer hand. And this is me blowing my own horn, but actually, the last thing I did was a memoir. It was about how I went from playing in rock bands and writing songs to um, writing books. And I just did it for myself. I spent 2023 writing it. I say to keep sane, but it was. I don't know how that much that worked, but that was the idea, because I just need to keep working on something, and I hadn't any work, and so I just sat down and started sort of, well, because people often ask me, how did you go from playing in a rock band to like writing the books you do? And I said, okay, well, how did I? And so I just did that. And then at the end, I sent it to a reader from one of my publishers. And I wasn't necessarily submitting it, but I was saying, well, I appreciate your taste and your comments on my other books. So I just wonder what you would think of this. And then he passed it on. And so they're publishing it. So yeah.
What's the title of that one?
Touched by the Presence.
Oh,
It
okay.
refers to the song. It refers to the song. So they will probably have to come up with some subtitle, because that's what publishers do all the time now. You have to have a subtitle
Yeah.
that says,
Okay.
how they say here, what does it say on the tin? Does it, what is this about? And you sort of have to say what this is about, so people,
Yeah.
but so I mean, I don't know. I don't know if enough people remember the song, or I'm certainly not a celebrity or anything like that. So, and it's not only that. There's starts my childhood and it goes up to when I left Los Angeles at the end of 1995, and to start my journey here. So there's a sequel if anyone's interested.
But that one's coming out soon, or
Oh, it's with my publisher now. So
okay.
I'm waiting to get the copy editing back.
So was that experience writing the memoir? I guess the question is, how was it different than writing the other kinds of books that you write?
A lot less research.
It's true.
That's for sure. But no, it was interesting. It was interesting because I had written a memoir before, which was specifically about my years in music, and that's still in print in the States, and that's called New York Rocker: My Life in the Blank Generation. So that covers 1974 to 1981. So this memoir just finished is like what happened before that and what happened after that. And so there's a few chapters devoted to the music. So it's not only that. No, it was interesting because I don't know how to say it. I mean, that's a bland. It was a different experience, and invariably you go through things in your life that and you probably mulled over in your head, but once you start to write about them, it's very different. It's a very
Mm.
different thing. And there were some things I thought I would have wanted to write about, and I tried. And when I read back, I said, no, I just don't. It didn't come across well.
Mm.
And what I did was keep to the story. So I mention as few names as possible. Some
Okay.
people rate an initial, and some people it's a friend or some friends. But it wasn't a matter of like rating them, but it was more like just tell the story. Because the other kind is like it's all the detail. Oh, who was that and where did da. And that I'm in no way a celebrity, so nobody wants to know all that kind of stuff. And in fact, if anybody does, that gives somebody a reason to write a biography of me, sometime. With some poor graduate student who has absolutely no thesis material might dig me out somewhere. So but in any case, give them something to do. So I just like told the story. So it's the closest thing I've come to writing a novel, put it that way.
Okay. Yeah.
Which is something I'd like to do, but I'll say that from my sunset years, which I think are rather quickly approaching, probably. So.
You're a celebrity in the consciousness studies world.
Well, I always say and anybody can be a rock star. I'm a cult figure.
There you go.
There you go.
Here's a personal canoper question for you. If you could wake up tomorrow having gained one quality or ability that you don't have now, what would it be?
Patience.
Mm. Yeah, I could use a dose of that.
Yeah, I can be very impatient. Yeah.
Well, that says it all, because there's some theologian that says all of sin arises from the lack of patience. I don't know who said that.
It was Pascal. Pascal said that everything wrong with human beings is that they can't sit quietly in a room.
Yeah.
Yeah. I guess it depends on the room, but but I know. I mean, I just, and it's because I have this, I got to get things done. I got to get things done kind of thing, which is very left brain. The right brain's like, oh, look at that puddle,
right?
And which I like, but I'm also like, and I mean, it took bigger practice. I say to myself, okay, slow down, try to slow down, try to slow down. And there's a quote from Hermann Hesse that Wilson refers to, and I say it as well, and it's in his novel Journey to the East. And he says, a long time devoted to small details exalts us and increases our strength. So that's a practice I do. Say, think of something you have to do, some boring, stupid, repetitive kind of task or job or something. Like tomorrow, Thursday's house cleaning day for me. So I clean my flat on Thursday. Right. And I try to look forward to it in that way, or again, instead of having that, oh, fuck, I gotta clean my, just put a little more into it. And I think that is true, that if you put something, it's in a way, it's kind of reverse. There's the scene in Tom Sawyer, Mark Twain's Tom Sawyer, where Tom has to paint the fence. He doesn't really want to paint the fence. And he starts pretending that it's a lot of fun thing to do. And his friends they were all hanging out, kind of making fun of him because he had to paint the fence. But he started saying, I sure am enjoying myself painting this fence, whatever. And they start, can I try? Can I try? And he gets them really excited. And so he gets them to paint the fence. But the joke is on him because they actually enjoy painting the fence. So the fence gets painted. He's the one who loses out because he thinks, okay, I'm cool. I got them to paint the fence, but he didn't get the joy out of painting the fence. And again, that in a way, that's a Gurdjieff kind of technique. There's some boring thing that it's the most boring thing that you have to do. The next time you have to do it, love doing it. Put everything you got into doing it. Yeah. And you may very well find that this is an enjoyable thing. I know a couple years ago, I painted my flat. I tried to get professional painters in, but they cost, my God, what they cost is just ridiculous. And so okay, I'll just do it myself. I'm horrible at it. I'm not a DIY person at all, but I thought I'll just do it. And in the background, I put on shakuhachi flute music, Japanese flute music. I thought it was very zen. And I wanted to go paint my neighbor's flat. I loved it. I just loved it, more than anything else. And that's something I try to remember whenever I get, I don't know what it is, frustrated, bored, depressed, or something like that. Go do something physical. Yeah. Go do something physical. And whatever happens, you forget whatever you're obsessing about, and then surprised by the duster. Yes. And it's like, what is this thing in my hand? But it sounds ridiculously banal, but it's true.
The classic saying, before enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. After
Yep.
enlightenment, chop wood, carry water.
Absolutely.
No, there is something.
Talk won't cook the rice.
Yeah, there's something actually meditative about that process when we put that intention into the work.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, that's what I think. I mean, rather, because I tend to get bored sitting and trying to meditate. When I was young, I tried to do the Zen thing, and I just never quite got a hang of it. But doing something, I can whatever, try to be whatever it is, whatever you want to call it, mindfulness or being in the presence or whatever it is. In the Gurdjieff work, they call it self-remembering, just basically trying to remembering that you exist, basically. Because most of the time we forget that we exist. And so we're watching something. We're sitting in a portable cinema, seat, watching what's going on around us, and we forget we're actually in, and there's a behind. We're in a 3D thing, but we just tend to think of it like that. It's Plato's cave, But the AI on your computer screen is the souped up, upgraded Plato's cave. Today it's the same thing. We're looking at pictures on the wall, and it's only in those rare moments when I'm surprised by the sun and I realize it's not something it's not on a mural. It's a thing I can't get my arms around it, but it's a three-dimensional thing that's in depth out there in space and all that. And that's ancient Hermetists that I wrote about in the book called Quest of Hermes Trismegistos, who was this legendary savant and sage and father of magic and all of that. They did this kind of, we don't know quite exactly what they did, but there was a kind of weird meditative kind of practice where they wanted to achieve cosmic consciousness, which is precisely that notion of you perceive that world about you is real. I don't know how to say it because we don't have. That's the problem. We don't have a language for this sort of thing.
The one word is expansion. Something that expands.
Yeah. I think we can know something and not know it at the same time, and then you can really know it. Or I say know in italics. So before I was surprised by the sun. Oh, I knew the sun was up there. What's that? Oh, that's the sun. It's 93 million miles away. You can swallow a million Earths and blah, 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 blah. So I knew it, but I didn't really know that. And in the morning I walked out and I saw it. I really knew that what the sun was for a brief.
The same thing applies to the self then, right?
Exactly, yes. Anything.
It's embodiment.
Yeah.
When you had the experience with the sun, you were embodying the sun.
Well, I took on that,
the portrait view of it.
Yes. 3D, whatever it is. And all the HD stuff that we go out of our way. It's so weird that we're so alienated from real reality, but we do everything we can to make the fake reality as real as the real reality. So that's that's a strange one for me. But all the efforts to do that are nothing. That moment when I felt that.
Right.
And I have to say, I mean, I wish I could devote myself to only trying to recapture that again. And I look forward to a time when I would be able to do that.
Yeah, you can, of course. with 4 minutes to go.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry. We didn't leave any questions. I'm sorry. I was just rambling on here.
Anyone can pop in, but to get back to the big picture in 2 minutes, the evolution of consciousness and archaic, magical, mythic, rational, mental, rational, then integral. So what's your headline with all the chaos and mayhem we're experiencing now with the breakdown of the mental rational? What's your statement to the press?
Well, you nailed it. I mean, I think we're going through what Gebser called the breakdown of the mental rational consciousness structure. And I think if he was still around, he'd be, I told you so. I mean, he died in 1973. And I think a variety of the crises that, we're experiencing were happening then, and others have happened. And once, I mean, even the intellectual tradition itself, deconstructionism, postmodernism, it's like eating itself up and all that kind of thing. So it's not a picnic, and I don't, you don't need me to tell you that. And I just, hold on, fasten your seatbelts. It's going to be a bumpy ride. But I think I always think of well, someone who's a contemporary of Gebser, the historian Arnold Toynbee, and he had what I call the Goldilocks theory of history, and it's the idea that if you ever go to a deserted island, take a copy of his study of history, which is like 20 volumes. So it's something like that that'll keep you occupied for a while. But his fundamental idea in that context is that he studied civilizations, and he said what happens is civilizations, they go through what he calls their time of trouble. And this is during which they face a crisis or a challenge. And if the challenge is too great, they can't overcome it, and it just smash, and it happens very quickly. So, Tsarist Russia, the Romanovs and the rise of, the Bolsheviks and all that. Or if they overcome it too easily, they become complacent and kind of decadent, and they have a slow kind of, withdrawal. So maybe like the Byzantine Empire or something like that. I'm just pulling it out of my head. Those examples might not be right. But this is Goldilocks bit. But if the challenge is just right, if they can muster enough energy and will to overcome it and break on through, carry on, it gets through the time of trouble. He said, unfortunately, out of the 19 civilizations I've studied, 18 have failed, and 19th is Western civilization, and I'm dying in 1975. So he said, cling and wait. So I don't know. I mean, a contemporary writer, E. McGilchrist, who's written a lot about the left and right brain, he talks similarly about what we're going through because of the left brain dominant world we're in, and it's created a world of all kind of scientific reductionist, masculinist sort of controlling the world sort of thing, because that's what it does. And it's cut out all the right brain. But he says historically, when things have got out of balance like that, usually a crisis somehow, it's sort of like the transcendent function in the way it sort of forces the other side to come in. So I don't know. In one sense, I think since say the 1960s, the occult revival going into the 70s and the New Age, and now in a way, I think that's a kind of seepage, maybe, into wider popular consciousness of some of the virtues. And I don't want to reduce it to left and right brain, but the other things that are neglected. So there's a seepage in there. But
I agree.
Yeah,
I don't know. I mean, I personally think it's up to individuals, and who work it out for yourself, and that way, it'll perhaps help by example, or somehow you'll be able to act in the world from that perspective, rather than being, overwhelmed by. Because it's every time is a dangerous time, but we live in this very strange epistemological kind of no man's land where like everything is plausible, nothing's definite. So it's like a series of trap doors kind of falling through with like what's true and all that sort of thing. And so I think the individual needs to somehow gain that Goldilocks moment in ourselves, where we can feel the two absolutely necessary sides. And again, who cares? It doesn't have to be brain, or it could be whatever. It doesn't have to be located anywhere physiologically. We know the difference between these two modes of engaging with the world.
So on that note, that's our hour of power.
Awesome.
And we'll continue to bless the moment, trust ourselves, and expect the best.
Yeah, well, thank you very much. I appreciate you asking me to come on.
Thank you.